When Mr. Anderson arrived home after a long day of work, he felt the usual comfort of his quiet suburban residence. He tossed his keys on the kitchen counter, but something else caught his eye. His teenage daughter, Emily, was standing in front of the mirror, adjusting her dress and hair, a glint of excitement on her face. She was more dressed up than usual, which piqued his curiosity. "What's the occasion?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but already feeling a little uncomfortable. Emily smiled at her reflection, her eyes shining with a joy that made him both proud and a little apprehensive. "Oh, nothing much, just someone's coming over today." Anderson's eyebrows rose. He had suspected it, but he wanted to hear it from her directly. "Who?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light, but his voice betrayed a hint of concern. "My new boyfriend," Emily replied with a mischievous smile. Anderson's heart raced. Boyfriend? She'd never mentioned one before, and suddenly his protective instincts went into overdrive. To him, she was still his little girl, and the word boyfriend sounded strange, even threatening. "Boyfriend?" he repeated, trying to hide his discomfort with a nervous laugh. "Yes, Dad. It's no big deal. I like him a lot, he's just different," Emily replied, softening her tone as if expecting some resistance. Before Anderson could answer, the doorbell rang, and his stomach tightened. Emily went to the door, while Anderson remained in the kitchen, unsure of what to expect. When the door opened, a tall, well-dressed young man appeared. "Hello, Mr. Anderson, I'm Malcolm," the young man said confidently, offering his hand with a polite smile. Anderson blinked in surprise. Malcolm was black. It wasn't what he expected, and although he didn't want to admit it, his mind was filled with assumptions and prejudices he thought he had overcome. The tension in the room increased, not only because his daughter had a boyfriend, but because of who that boyfriend was. "Malcolm, huh?" Anderson replied, shaking his hand firmly but without warmth. He forced a smile, but felt a knot growing in his chest. "Yes, sir," Malcolm replied politely, sensing the discomfort in the air but maintaining his composure. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Emily has told me a lot about you." Anderson's eyes drifted to his daughter, who was smiling, unaware of the internal storm brewing in her father's mind. He watched Malcolm warily, not rudely, but assessing every detail. Malcolm seemed polite and respectful, but that didn't ease Anderson's racing, clouded thoughts, fueled by old prejudices. He knew nothing about this boy, and it made him uneasy. The conversation between Emily and Malcolm flowed naturally, but Anderson was silent most of the time, occasionally nodding or responding vaguely. He was evaluating Malcolm, but not for his character or intelligence. He was stuck in his own fears and stereotypes that, as much as he didn't want to admit it, were still there, latent. When Malcolm said goodbye, promising to see Emily again, Anderson could barely contain his uneasiness. As soon as the door closed, he finally spoke. "Emily, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with this." His voice was low but firm. "What do you mean, Dad?" Emily asked, with a mixture of confusion and frustration. "I mean you're too young to date someone, especially someone like him," Anderson replied, his concern showing. Emily frowned. "What do you mean, someone like him?" "Malcolm is a great person. He treats me with respect, isn't that what matters?" Anderson took a deep breath. "You barely know him, you don't know where he came from, who he hangs out with. I just don't want you to regret it." Emily's voice rose in disbelief. "Dad, you're judging him without even knowing him. Just because he's different. Is that it?" Anderson shook his head, denying it, but deep down he knew that, somehow, she was right. She had touched a nerve. "I just want to protect you," he said, trying to justify his fears. "He may seem nice, but you don't really know people like that." Emily, frustrated, raised her voice. "People like that? What do you mean, Dad? Are you talking like Malcolm is a threat just because of where he's from or what he looks like? That's not fair." Mr. Anderson stood his ground, unwilling to admit his prejudice but unable to ignore his feelings. I'm your father, Emily. It's my job to take care of you. I don't trust him, and I don't think you should either. Emily's eyes filled with hurt. You're not protecting me, you're judging someone you don't even know. Malcolm is a good person, and if you can't see that, maybe the problem is yours. Before he could respond, Emily turned and went upstairs, leaving Mr. Anderson alone, his air heavy with tension. He didn't know how to handle the situation, or even if he wanted to, but one thing was certain, his little girl was growing up, and the world around her was changing in ways that made him uncomfortable. Even though Malcolm had been polite and respectful, something inside him couldn't fully trust. It wasn't just that he was Emily's first boyfriend, there was something else. Mr. Anderson couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the need to protect his daughter was turning into an obsession. Later that night, he sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. He opened the browser and hesitantly typed in Malcolm's full name. It felt wrong, even invasive, but he convinced himself that it was for Emily's own good. What did he really know about the boy? Where did he come from? What kind of family did he have? The search results were sparse. Malcolm's social media pages were nearly empty, which Mr. Anderson found odd. Most kids these days shared everything online, but Malcolm barely had a social media presence. This only heightened his suspicions. Was he hiding something? The next day, Mr. Anderson's obsession went even further. He went to school and began casually chatting with teachers, trying to discreetly bring Malcolm into the conversation. Most of them spoke highly of him, praising his grades and behavior, but that didn't calm him down. It felt like something was being left out or covered up. He even began to probe Emily's friends when they came over, asking what they thought of Malcolm. One of them mentioned the neighborhood he lived in, which didn't have the best reputation, and that was enough to send Mr. Anderson's mind spinning scenarios. If Malcolm lived in a bad neighborhood, what kind of life did he really lead? What was he hiding? His paranoia grew. Malcolm's clean record and polite demeanor began to seem like a facade, something created to get closer to Emily. Mr. Anderson believed there was something darker behind this boy. The frustration reached a peak one night when he confronted Emily again. She was on the phone, laughing at something Malcolm had said, when her father walked into the room, his eyes serious. "We need to talk about Malcolm," he said, his voice thick with tension. "What about him?" Emily asked, confused. "I need to know more about him," Mr. Anderson continued. "Where he comes from, what his family does. How much do you really know about him?" "Dad, I told you," Emily replied, visibly irritated. "His mother works a lot, and his father is dead. What else do you need to know?" "It's not just about his parents," Mr. Anderson replied. "What kind of life does he lead? Where does he live? Have you been to his house?" "No, Dad. I haven't been to his house yet, and honestly, it doesn't matter. Malcolm is a good person." "Why does it matter?" "Because I don't know him, and neither do you," Mr. Anderson insisted, his voice rising. "You can't trust someone if you don't know where they're coming from. What if they're hiding something?" Emily, tired and frustrated, snapped, "Hiding what, Dad? Malcolm isn't a criminal. He's worked hard all his life, and his family has been through a lot. Just because you don't know all the details of his story doesn't mean he's a bad person." Mr. Anderson shook his head, unwilling to give in. "You're being naive, Emily. You're still too young to understand how the world works." "People aren't always what they seem," Mr. Anderson said, as Emily looked at him with disappointment in her eyes. "Dad, I think you're the one who doesn't understand here. Your own fears and prejudices are blinding you. Malcolm has always been kind and respectful, but you refuse to see beyond your preconceived ideas." Before he could respond, Emily left the room, leaving him standing there, his thoughts racing. He didn't want to admit it, but his daughter's words had struck a chord. Was he letting his own prejudices cloud his judgment? Doubt crept in, even though he fought it. That night, Unable to shake his suspicions, Mr. Anderson resolved to dig deeper into Malcolm's past. He spent hours searching for any evidence that would support his fears, until he found something that stopped him in his tracks. Malcolm's father was not only dead, he had been a war hero, decorated for bravery. This discovery took Mr. Anderson by surprise. He had expected Malcolm's past to be something to fear, but this revelation made him question his assumptions. As he stared at the screen, a mixture of confusion and guilt washed over him. How could he have been so wrong? How had he let his assumptions get him so far? But as much as he tried to process it, he still felt like he didn't know the whole story. For the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to know the whole truth. The weight of what he had learned settled in his mind, and he began to reconsider the image he had created of Malcolm. The conflict within him grew, but he wasn't ready to admit he had been wrong yet. Reluctantly, he agreed to Emily's idea of inviting Malcolm and his mother over for dinner. Though uneasiness consumed him, he accepted, part of him wishing he could see more about Malcolm's family. Maybe then he could confirm his suspicions. When Malcolm and his mother, Mrs. Johnson, arrived, the atmosphere grew tense. Mr. Anderson tried to keep things polite, but the discomfort was evident. Mrs. Johnson was warm and polite, thanking him for the invitation, and Malcolm, as always, was respectful. However, Mr. Anderson could not shake his suspicions. The conversation was superficial at first, with the usual formal exchanges. Emily tried to keep the mood light, asking about Mrs. Johnson's work, but each time Malcolm spoke, Mr. Anderson became suspicious. He analyzed every word, looking for signs of falsehood, but Malcolm remained calm and polite, responding calmly. As dinner wore on, Mr. Anderson found it increasingly difficult to control his feelings. The fact that he knew so little about the young man who had become so important to his daughter made him uneasy. His thoughts intensified, and he began to question how trustworthy Malcolm really was. Finally, unable to contain himself any longer, Mr. Anderson turned to Malcolm, his voice thick with the frustration he had been suppressing. "So, Malcolm, what are your plans for the future? What do you plan to do after school?" Malcolm, who seemed aware of the tension of the evening, calmly replied, "I'm aiming for an engineering scholarship." "Engineering, huh?" Mr. Anderson narrowed his eyes. "And how do you plan to pay for that? Scholarships don't cover everything." Emily tried to interject, but he silenced her with a gesture. Malcolm, however, stood his ground. "I'm working part-time and saving what I can. I know it will be difficult, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." "But what about your family?" Mr. Anderson pressed, his tone sharper. "Do they support you in these plans, or are you thinking of doing it all yourself?" Emily's voice rose, but Mr. Anderson had already issued the challenge. Emily was clearly shaken by the way her father was speaking to Malcolm. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "My mother was always supportive of me," he said, looking at Mrs. Johnson. "She tried hard to give me every opportunity, even after my father died." Mrs. Johnson nodded proudly. "He's right," she added. "Malcolm was always determined, and I did everything I could to help him succeed." Mr. Anderson frowned. Even though he knew about Malcolm's father, something still bothered him. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "And what about your father? What kind of man was he?" The question hung in the air, making the room even more tense. Malcolm hesitated for a brief moment, but remained calm. "My father was a soldier. He died in the line of duty when I was very young." Mr. Anderson nodded slowly, but his eyes remained cold. "A soldier, huh? It must have been hard. But tell me, do you really think you're the right kind of person for my daughter?" Silence fell, and Emily's mouth fell open in shock. Mrs. Johnson stared at Mr. Anderson in disbelief, but Malcolm didn't waver. Without raising his voice or showing anger, he kept his gaze firmly on Mr. Anderson. "With all due respect," Malcolm began, "I'm not here to prove that I'm good enough for anyone. I care about Emily and I treat her with the respect she deserves. My father taught me that a person's character is what really matters, not where they come from or what others think. Mr. Anderson's jaw tightened, but Malcolm continued calmly. I know you have doubts about me and my intentions. And I understand that you want to protect your daughter, and I respect that. But I won't accept being judged based on assumptions. I've worked hard to get where I am, and I'm proud of that. I've never taken anything for granted. Mr. Anderson remained silent, waiting for Malcolm to contradict himself or show some weakness, but the young man stood firm. With a brief pause, Malcolm concluded, my father was not just a soldier, he was a decorated hero who saved lives and died defending his country. I spend my life trying to honor the example he set for me. Malcolm's words echoed around the room, and Mr. Anderson felt a crack in his certainties. His beliefs, based on prejudice and fear, began to crumble. He remained silent, trying to process what he had just heard. Everything he thought he knew about Malcolm and his family seemed wrong. Now, before him, stood a young man who demonstrated more maturity and dignity than he had. Sitting at the table after dinner, Mr. Anderson reflected on the evening. Emily had gone upstairs without saying a word to him, and Malcolm had left without a backward glance. Even Mrs. Johnson, who had remained calm throughout the encounter, politely excused herself before leaving. Alone in the dimly lit kitchen, Mr. Anderson replayed every word of their conversation. The disappointment in Emily's eyes and Malcolm's calm handling of each accusation still echoed in his mind. As the reality of his mistake sank in, he realized that he had judged Malcolm unfairly, based on irrational fears that clouded his judgment. He remembered his own father, who had always taught him to judge people by their actions, not their appearance or background. Yet here he was, years later, failing to apply that lesson. The weight of his guilt weighed on him, leaving him with the bitter regret of nearly losing his daughter's trust. As he sat reflecting on his actions, Mr. Anderson realized that Malcolm had never been the problem. Despite all the testing he had been subjected to, Malcolm had remained respectful and calm. Only now could Mr. Anderson see that his own fears and prejudices were the real villains in the story. With a heavy sigh, he rose from the table and walked into the living room, where he slumped onto the couch, the weight of his mistakes weighing him down. Malcolm's words about his father, a war hero, echoed in his mind. At first, he didn't want to believe them. It was hard to admit that Malcolm came from a family of honor and sacrifice. But curiosity got the better of him, and the next day, Mr. Anderson found himself in the library, leafing through old military records. It didn't take long for him to find what he was looking for. Malcolm's father, Sergeant David Johnson, had not only served his country, but had done so with distinction. His name was among those who had given their lives to save others. As he read more about Sergeant Johnson, Mr. Anderson felt his heart sink. Medals of valor were awarded to Malcolm's father, a man who had risked everything to ensure the safety of others. This began to weigh on his conscience. Malcolm's mother had also excelled, working multiple jobs to ensure her son had the opportunities his father would have wanted. Malcolm, in turn, devoted himself to his studies and helped out at home, displaying a resilience few have. Mr. Anderson, now with a new perspective, felt the weight of his own failings. He should never have judged Malcolm, especially without really knowing him. This young man was not just from any neighborhood, but the son of a man of honor, carrying with him the strength and character that Mr. Anderson had always wanted his daughter to find in a partner. Yet, he had almost destroyed that chance through ignorance. The guilt settled deep. It was not only Malcolm he had hurt, but also Emily, his daughter, who trusted him to be fair. Now, sitting with this burden, Mr. Anderson knew that a simple apology would not be enough to repair the damage. He would need to take action to regain their trust. He made up his mind to apologize and make an effort to truly get to know Malcolm, without any preconceptions. He knew that winning Emily back would take time and that Malcolm might not forgive him so quickly, but he was prepared to work hard to earn this chance. For the first time in a long time, Mr. Anderson felt clarity. Now he saw Malcolm for who he really was, a man of worth, worthy of respect, someone he should be proud of for taking care of his daughter. As he left the library, Mr. Anderson felt a growing determination. He couldn't change the past, but he was willing to make amends for his mistakes in the future. He picked up the phone, dialed Emily's number, and when she answered in a cold, distant voice, he knew it would be a long road. Still, he began with what he knew was essential. "Emily, I have to apologize." There was a pause on the other end of the line. He continued, his voice softer than usual, admitting, "I was wrong about Malcolm. My fears clouded my judgment, and it caused me to treat him unfairly." Emily's lack of response hurt more than any words could. Knowing he had to continue, he added, "I let my prejudices get the better of me, and I'm so sorry for that." As he reflected on his actions, he couldn't help but think of Malcolm. The young man had always been respectful, calm, and collected, even when pushed to the limit. Now, Mr. Anderson understood that the problem had never been Malcolm, but rather his own unfounded fears. With a deep sigh, he got up from the table and walked into the living room, sinking into the couch, feeling the weight of his mistakes. Malcolm's words about his father, a decorated war hero, kept coming back to him. At first, he had been reluctant to believe it, reluctant to accept that Malcolm came from an honorable family. But now, he knew he could no longer ignore it. His curiosity drove him to seek out more information. The next day, Mr. Anderson went to the local library and, after looking through military records, found what he was looking for. Malcolm's father, Sergeant David Johnson, was indeed a hero, recognized for acts of bravery during several combat missions. As he read about the sergeant's life, Mr. Anderson's heart sank. Johnson had saved several comrades on a mission gone wrong, sacrificing his own life. The more he read, the deeper Mr. Anderson came to understand his own mistakes. He also learned about the resilience of Malcolm and his mother after the sergeant's death. The young man's mother did everything she could to support her son, and Malcolm, even in the midst of hardship, excelled in his studies and helped out at home. It was a story of resilience and hard work. Sitting there, wrapped in the weight of the truth, Mr. Anderson realized how blind he had been. Malcolm was not just any young man, but someone who embodied everything he wanted for his daughter. Regret washed over him. Knowing that words alone would not be enough to make amends for what he had done, Mr. Anderson decided he needed to apologize. Not just to Emily, but to Malcolm as well. He was willing to swallow his pride and admit his mistakes, even if it meant facing the discomfort of his own shortcomings. Although regaining Emily's trust and Malcolm's forgiveness would take time, Mr. Anderson was prepared to put in the effort. The next morning, he called Malcolm and, after a few nervous moments, managed to arrange a meeting. As they sat down, Mr. Anderson made a genuine apology, acknowledging that he had judged Malcolm unfairly based on prejudice and assumptions. He expressed his regret and his desire to make things right. Malcolm listened quietly, considering his words before responding. He was not one to hold grudges, but he also knew that he could not simply ignore what had happened. "Actions speak louder than words," he said calmly, making it clear that he expected to be treated with the respect he deserved. Later, Mr. Anderson extended an invitation to Malcolm and his mother for dinner at his home. This time, it was not out of obligation, but rather a sincere attempt to start over. The mood in the house was different, lighter, and the conversation flowed naturally. Mr. Anderson was interested in hearing about Malcolm's interests, his plans for the future, and his life story. For the first time, he saw the young man as someone worthy of admiration, rather than a threat. By the end of the evening, any remaining tension had disappeared, replaced by mutual respect. Back at home, reflecting on everything that had happened, Mr. Anderson felt a mix of emotions. He was grateful for the opportunity to make amends, but the guilt of nearly losing his daughter's trust and pushing away someone who had shown him nothing but respect still plagued him. But most of all, he felt like he had grown. His fear of the unknown had nearly blinded him to the truth about Malcolm, and it had nearly destroyed a beautiful relationship. Smiling to himself, he realized that while he had made mistakes, he had also learned, grown, and changed. And that, he knew, was the most important lesson. It's never too late to acknowledge your mistakes, learn from them, and start over. If you've ever been through something like this or know someone who needs to hear this message, share this story and inspire others to take the first step toward change.